welcome to another episode of From Our Kitchen. Today is clean up the pantry and clean up the refrigerator day. I have a day off, so I've decided to make some soup. Portuguese inspired soup. It's not quite a traditional kale soup, although it's in the ballpark. But I'm going to make this soup using things that I have in my fridge, meats that I had in my freezer, things that I had around the house and in the pantry. And I've made it before. It's always a little different depending on how you mix things up and what you do with it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I use when I'm making my big pot of Portuguese soup. First off, these are kales, very fresh kales that my husband grew in his hydroponic greenhouse, so they're extremely clean. I've chopped them. A little bit of the stalk while I'm chopping. I'm not a big one for the stalks in the soup. He likes it, and he really likes kale, so this is a lot of kale. Couldn't even tell you how much it is, but you can see by the size of the bowl. It's quite a bit. I also have a small head of cabbage. I really like my Portuguese soups that have both kale and cabbage. I have some pork. I will show you this a little bit more close up in a minute. This is a pork loin roast on the bone that I have cut some of the fat and trimmed some of the fat from, but retained some because it's really going to make the broth delicious. I had in my pantry these tiny cute little potatoes. I've never used these types of potatoes in my soup, and they're too small to really skin, so this is totally an experiment. It may work, it may not work, but we'll give it a try. I like potato skin. I don't know if I'm going to like it in my soup, but these are so tiny, and these were the only white potatoes I had. I did have one sweet potato that I have taken the skin off of and just cut to 2 pieces. I have one rope or one package of regular store-bought here in New England linguica, and 2, I would say, large onions that I have chopped. Not minced, chopped. Not a rough chop, maybe a little smaller, certainly not diced. On the spice side, of course, I have my coarse ground sea salt. And I do have a red pepper paste from Portugal that I use to give the base a little zing. I do have some red pepper flakes, a little bit of paprika. I do like Rachel Ray's 24/7 everyday spice mix. It's really good for any dish. Of course, olive oil, like any good Portuguese kitchen. And I have my pepper mill for some different types of peppers. I do have some hot sauce and some piri, which I usually save till the end. And typically, I might just add a few dashes for a little excitement. But most people, if they want that, they can add it to their bowl, along with any other things that might make it more salty or more spicy. I always start off my soups with some chicken broth. Sometimes I use a mix of chicken and beef, but in addition to that, I don't add more broths. I typically add more water depending on how I'm doing with the liquid content. So I always have a few bouillon cubes, chicken or beef or vegetable, whatever you have, depending on how the broth is coming out as it's simmering. So those are the ingredients, and I will meet you at the stove. Okay, so I'm here at the stove, and as you can see, I have a very, very big pot to make this in. Or as they say in Portuguese, big pot. This is just a big calfon or whatever pot. First thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take care of putting in the meats, the onions, and kind of let that all cook. So it's about time we get started. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add this rather large, I think it's 48 ounces, container of chicken stock. You can make your own chicken stock, you can use your own, you can use water with bouillon, or you will get stock from your vegetables, and you will get stock. I just like mine a little bit more rich, so I like to start it off with this and a smaller size. This is a big pan, folks, and then I use a smaller size of the beef kind. Yes, beef and chicken. I don't know where or if other people do it. I'm sure they do. But because this is the kind of soup where you can put any kind of meat and any kind of veggie, I don't know, tastes really good and works for me. To that, I will now turn on. I'll put it on the low flame here, but this is where I'm going to put my 2 onions. And I said that the meats would go in, and here I have that beautiful, beautiful pork. Sometimes I add beef and pork. Today I am just adding the pork. Dwayne is partial to pork in his soup. I kind of like the beef, but take me either way. I will add the linguica. Notice I've cut the linguica into bite-sized rings. Oops, some people put big hunks in their soup, and you can cut it after. And some people actually cook their meats rather whole and take it out and serve it on a side dish where people can cut the linguica, cut the meats, different types of meats, and then add it to their plate or have it alongside their plate with their broth in their soup. I'm gonna make mine kind of a quasi mixture. You saw how big the pieces of meat were. Those would be really nearly ready to shred and fall apart before serving. And then I'm adding the linguica to this pot like that. You can see it like that. Looking good so far. I do add, it does give you a little bit of flavor, olive oil at this point. We'll be right back and I'll show you a couple of the seasonings, and then we're gonna let this simmer for quite a while. A good soup takes time. Maybe a little less than half the pot. The onion, the meat, the linguica, and all of that here. I am going to add now some water. And if I look at the gauge on the side of my water pot here, I would say I'm adding about 5 cups or so. To this, I'm adding some bouillon for more full, rich flavor. This is just any bouillon that you might like. This is just your average one that you buy in any store. I think it's called Simply Chicken, and it's a low sodium one. Give it that flavorful broth. It also helps with the salt. This one's a low sodium, but it kind of helps give you just that saltiness before you really add any salt. And we're not going to add a lot of salt while this cooks. We'll add a little now with some other seasonings, but not a ton until we taste it at the end and do a final tasting. Nothing worse than having to adjust soups that come out too salty. Okay, speaking of salt. No. Actually, speaking of salt, I'm using the coarse, and I will add what looks to be a couple, I don't know, teaspoons maybe, and that is it. Remember, once the kale gets here, once the cabbage gets in here, once all those vegetables and the potatoes are dancing in here, that's when you're really going to be able to taste what that broth is like with everything in it and after it's been cooking. One thing I do think adds to the taste of this broth is a little paprika. You do have some in your linguica. It'll give it a pretty color. And then this is like the Portuguese version, and I'll show you the brand, of sofrito. It's a base that you can use for soups, sauces, just about anything, and I discovered it. This one's actually made of red pepper. It's called in Portuguese massa de pimento. I think it's a red pepper paste. It's garlicky smelling, and it's going to give this a beautiful color. I add this to making, when I make any stews, I add it to my soups. Just a couple, making a mess here, just a couple of teaspoons. The other thing I like to do, not a lot, this is pimenta moída, or as we say, hot red pepper flakes. Again, if you're using very spicy chorizo linguica, be careful. But you can adjust all of this at the end, so don't be fearful. Okay, this is that Rachel Ray 24/7 Everyday Allspice Mix. It just has a number of really nice things already blended together. If I look at it has a little bit of sea salt, coriander, it has garlic, black pepper, corns, red bell pepper, some chili, cumin, a couple of different things that give it a really nice flavor, and it's grinding up. Again, the more complexity, the easier it is at the end to really bring those flavors together. And then just a little bit of the peppercorn, a couple of shakes there. And we're just going to let this sit now for a little bit. You can see everything in here. We're not adding any vegetables, and we're not adding any greens until later. In fact, the greens come first. Then last will be the potatoes, especially the sweet potatoes, and the elbow macaroni, which I forgot to mention, a little bit of pasta in this dish to round it out and make it a hearty meal. This is going to be here for a while. I'll catch up when it's ready for the next step. So we're back. This has been simmering for a little bit, roughly about an hour. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add about 3/4 of that small cabbage that I've chopped into the soup. I did add some more water while it's been cooking because it was in need of more water. I knew I would have to have a lot more broth in here before adding any of the greens. So here goes the cabbage. Takes a little while to cook, it's not horrible. Kale is much faster, so I'm putting the cabbage in first. You can see it here. I did find, well, while I wasn't filming, a hunk of meat in the refrigerator that I was thawing for a different reason, but I decided to throw it in here. So now we have the cabbage in here, and next up will be the kale. Of course, I did something with the spoon. There it is. So here's the spoon, and here's the kale. Like I said, I put the potatoes in last, especially since mine are small. I do want this to cook down. This is a lot of kale. Don't know how much. It was almost everything he brought in from the garden yesterday. So let me see how it goes with that much. It really does smush down. But it gives the broth such a nice flavor. Kale soup is really heavenly. You know, it's funny. When I was a kid, kale was like a staple. Linguica was a staple. And then all of a sudden you grow up and kale's become this superfood that everybody eats. When I was a kid, we ate it. We ate it as a side dish. We ate it in soup. We ate it with our fish. I mean, we had kale all the time. And it was only when it became a superfood that I noticed all kinds of the non-Portuguese people getting into the kale. Now they juice it. They eat it raw in salads. And it's become quite the food trend. All right, you can see I'm getting there. You know, I'm really happy with the amount of liquid that I have in this pot because if you can imagine, it's going to simmer now for a while, and then look how nice and green and leafy it looks. What I'm going to do now, and I know it's a little dangerous because I haven't tasted it yet, but this amount of green and everything else, I am going to add a spray of sea salt. And again, remember, it'll really be the potatoes and the pasta that'll kind of leach some of that. But when things are cooking, the salt brings out the flavors of everything else in the pot. I'll also add just a little bit more pepper. And maybe because I don't think I added it before, just a spray of garlic powder. Remember, there's garlic in the linguica already, but just a little more complexity to the broth. I'm going to leave this on simmer. I'm going to cover it, and then we'll come back when it's time to add the potato back. And this has been simmering for a while now. And you know, I forgot to mention this before. I've been meaning to mention it, but this is cooking down. It's cooking down quite nicely, but now is right around the time when I add the beans. In this case, add the beans that you like. I don't care if you like using the traditional beans that are dried that you soak overnight, white beans, cannellini beans. I'm going to add some dark red kidney, which I've drained, to put here. I totally use canned beans most of the time. It's just much more convenient, especially when you're doing everything else for the soup and all the other chopping and prep. I just added 1 can there, and then I'm adding a can of plain old run-of-the-mill, this one's a generic brand, of pork and beans, because I find that these beans literally turn the broth into a whole other world that reminds me of, I don't know, growing up. And sometimes these little beans, they kind of dissolve, but they add a texture to this soup that's undeniable. And I just put those in there, so depending on what it looks like, you can see there's not tons of beans for the size of the pot, but I am still ready to add the pasta and the potatoes toward the end, so I think it'll be okay. And we'll be back when there's more to do. Look at this, it smells amazing. Everything's really simmering away, cooking down. I can smell the Wow, I can smell the broth. There's a good amount of liquid in here. I think I did that right. The meat is starting to fall off the bones. And it just really looks like it's getting to a very, very good place. A place that's good enough for me to now add the potatoes. So, I normally use plain white potatoes that I can cut into chunks, but I'm not even going to take the skin off these. If this is a bad mistake, I gave it a shot. I'm assuming these might take a little longer to cook than I did wash them and clean them and put them in a bowl. So I will either regret this or I will have found a new taste sensation. And I'm not afraid of trying things, so you shouldn't be either. The worst that can happen is it won't taste good. And next time you will go back to doing it the way you always have. I'm not going to put a ton in there though. I think a little's enough. And I do have sweet potatoes. Here we go. These are the sweet potatoes. This was actually one big potato that was just in the pantry. These cook very fast. So as you can imagine, the soup is nearly done. Let this go for a little bit, come in, and then we'll put in the elbow macaroni. Hopefully there'll still be room in this pot. I do plan on taking out the meats and cutting the meats into smaller, tiny, bite-sized chunks and then putting it back in, so I think that might make a difference, but cut me close with the size of the pot here, and that's the way I like it. Hey, look at this soup simmering away. The magic of editing, it's been a few hours. I can tell you that I have checked to see if the potatoes are cooked. Yes, it is. And to make sure the meat is getting, yes, almost off the bone. And let me see where those little potatoes that have the skin, right through. It's very important that you first check your liquid level, make sure that it's still enough. If not, add some water or a little bit of broth, whichever you like. This is looking really good, brothy, has enough liquid, the potatoes are in here. What you want to do now is actually take a few minutes or a few seconds. It might take a few minutes because it's very hot if it's been simmering for hours. You really want to do a final tasting. And I do that by just grabbing a little teaspoon, blowing on it, and you want to make sure it's not too hot. And see if it has enough salt for you. See if it needs some pepper. If there's any other flavor that you think it's lacking, now would be the time. Right now, I can tell it needs a little bit of salt, just a spray of salt. Remember, there's a lot of volume in here. And even though I've been adding salt little by little, now that we're at the end, it really does need some salt. Also, for my taste, it needs a little pepper. I'm going to put a little crushed red pepper. But because I can't leave well enough alone and I like bold flavors, some piri piri, which is a Portuguese pepper. We can use red hot pepper, any pepper. Hot sauces tend to have a little bit of salt and a little bit of vinegar in them. Just a few dashes, a few drops. You can always add more to your plate if you like things to be a little bit more bold. And I'm going to add a little bit of garlic powder just because I think it needs a little something in here. But that's about it. It definitely tasted beefy and brothy. It tasted well seasoned. You want your soup broth to be well seasoned. While you're at it, you do want to taste your kale. Your kale should not be crunching. So blow on it and taste your kale. Make sure your kale is soft. I've already tried one. You want to make sure the stalk and the leaf, if you have any stalk at all, and I always put a little, are soft. Now, the last thing we're going to do, give this a good stir. Like I said, I will serve it, but I will take the meat out and cut it in chunks, put it back in right before serving it, or just serving it separately and adding it to bowls of soup. But right now, I'm putting in the last of the ingredients. And I have here plain, basic elbow macaroni, nothing fancy. I can't put tons in it because it'll just turn into a, I don't know, kind of like a soupy macaroni-ish mess. I'm going to add roughly, and I can tell by looking, a cup, which is not a lot for a pot this big. And that should do it. That should do it. This macaroni will cook in this soup. And you want it to cook, it will not only cook, it will cook, expand. Every time I see a leaf that's just a little big, because I do like to cut it into chunks and bite-sized chunks, but sometimes a little bit gets away from me. But if you make the kale and the leaves too small, sometimes they just kind of melt away. I like them to have some substance to it. People could be eating the soup not just with a spoon, but with a fork and a little knife next to them, especially if they have meat. And we're kind of used to it that way. So, wow, potatoes, the sweet potatoes are cooked. And the pasta is cooking. There's really nothing left to do. In the next 5 or 10 minutes, that pasta will be cooked, and this soup will be ready to serve. Remember, if you are making this for the first time, don't be afraid to keep adjusting, adding more liquid, adding more spice, adding more beans, adding more potatoes, adding more pasta. Make it the way you like. And I think after you make it a few times, you can add different meats, you can add different ingredients. You can try using the same type of soup base for lots of different soups. You can see I have my red kidney beans in there, the linguica's in here, hunks of meat, and definitely a combination of both cabbage as well as kale. And we'll show you what this looks like plated when we're done. I can't wait for dinner tonight. This is going to be delicious. I'm just going to let it simmer long enough to let the pasta cook. I will cover this, and we'll see you when it's time to eat. And it's still a little early for dinner, but it's so beautiful. I've already cut up some of the meat. I left it chunky so that we can serve it at the plate. For each plate, you can see I've left it in here in smaller chunks. I cut up the beef, and now, you know, maybe just a little. You can see. I'm going to try the potato with the skin on it, at least one in my bowl. Just a little bit of the fat from the pork and the meat. This looks really good. Wow. Well, good luck making yourself some soup, and let me know what you think of this one if you try it. And we would really appreciate if you could hit that subscribe button, hit those like buttons, and help support our channel. And bon appetit!